billionaire refuses to stand in court. A powerful judge stares him down. He thinks money makes him untouchable. But today, the law fights back. Do you think billionaires should get special treatment? Or should they face justice like the rest of us? Tell us in the comments below. Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave the entire courtroom in shock. The air inside the packed courtroom was thick with tension. Reporters filled the gallery, their cameras rolling, capturing every second of this high-profile trial, a moment that had already gripped the nation. The fall of Ethan Wolfe, one of the most powerful men in America, was playing out in real time. Ethan Wolfe sat in the defendant's chair, completely unmoved. His posture was relaxed, his hands folded over his chest like a king surveying his court. There was no fear in his eyes. If anything, there was annoyance, disbelief that he had to be here at all. The tailored navy blue suit, the gleaming gold cufflinks, the expensive watch resting on his wrist, all of it screamed control, dominance, superiority. But what stood out the most was his defiance. "All rise," the bailiff's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. Chairs scraped against the floor as the entire courtroom rose to their feet. Lawyers, journalists, jurors, even the courtroom staff. It was an unspoken rule. When the judge entered, everyone stood. Everyone, except Ethan Wolfe. He didn't so much as flinch. He stayed firmly planted in his seat, his gaze locked forward, unfazed, unaffected. A ripple of unease spread across the room. A few whispers, a couple of exchanged glances. Even the security officers near the back of the courtroom subtly adjusted their stance. And then, Judge Naomi Carter entered. She moved with deliberate authority, her black robe flowing behind her, each step steady and unshaken. She had faced corruption before. She had brought down men more powerful than Ethan Wolfe. But today, this was different, because today the whole world was watching. She took her seat at the bench, her expression unreadable. Not angry, not surprised, just watching. She let the silence stretch, making sure he knew she saw him. Finally, her voice broke the stillness, low, firm, unwavering. In this courtroom, everyone stands when the judge enters. The weight of her words hung in the air. For the first time, Ethan moved, not to stand. No. Instead, he tilted his head ever so slightly, a slow, deliberate smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. His eyes gleamed with something dangerous, mocking. And then he spoke. "Not today, and definitely not for you." The reaction was instant. Gasps, murmurs, a sharp intake of breath from someone in the back row. Even the seasoned legal professionals in the room stiffened, sensing the shift in energy. One of his lawyers subtly turned toward him, his hand twitching as if he wanted to caution him to stop. But Ethan didn't care. He was making a statement. The cameras zoomed in. The moment was captured, immortalized, ready to explode across every news channel, every social media feed. Naomi Carter didn't react. She didn't blink, didn't move, didn't let the slightest hint of emotion cross her face. She simply watched him. Not as an adversary, not even as a criminal, but as a puzzle she had already solved. And then, bam, the sharp crack of the gavel striking wood cut through the room like a gunshot. A single, commanding blow. Ethan Wolfe leaned back in his chair, completely at ease. He thought he had won, but he had no idea what was coming next. Long before Ethan Wolfe found himself in a courtroom, he was a man who never heard the word no. He didn't just build wealth, he built an empire. What started as a small financial firm in his early 30s grew into Wolfe Global, a trillion-dollar powerhouse that didn't just dominate Wall Street, it dictated it. Ethan didn't just play the game, he rewrote the rules. When markets crashed, he decided who would survive and who would sink. When industries collapsed, it was his money that rebuilt them, but only if they swore loyalty to him. And politicians? They weren't leaders, they were assets. Ethan had senators, congressmen, even governors in his pocket. Laws were adjusted to suit his interests, regulations were bent in his favor. His influence reached far beyond Wall Street, it shaped the country. He controlled media networks, newspapers, digital platforms. Any narrative about him was carefully curated, polished, manipulated. Scandals were buried before they could make a headline. To the public, he was a visionary, a genius, a self-made success story. Behind the scenes, he was something else entirely, a puppeteer, a kingmaker, a man untouchable. But power breeds arrogance, and arrogance breeds mistakes. The cracks in his empire were small at first, a whisper of questionable investments, a journalist poking around a deal that didn't quite add up, a former executive caught in a money laundering scheme hinting at something bigger. Ethan ignored them, because who could touch him? But power is only power until someone decides to take it away. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Wolfe was about to realize he wasn't untouchable anymore. Power is an illusion. For years, Ethan Wolfe had lived under the belief that his was absolute, that no law could touch him, no scandal could stick, no enemy could rise high enough to take him down. But arrogance, it blinds even the sharpest minds. And Ethan never saw the knife coming. It started as a whisper in the dark, a leaked document here, an anonymous tip there, a signature that didn't match, a wire transfer that led to places it shouldn't. Then the whispers grew louder. A former executive, one of Ethan's own, flipped, exchanging immunity for testimony. A financial analyst uncovered inconsistencies too big to ignore. A buried investigation was suddenly brought back to life. And then the floodgates burst open. Wire fraud, tax evasion, insider trading, bribery, money laundering, millions of dollars funneled through shell companies. Deals made in backrooms, orchestrated at the highest levels of power. It wasn't just one crime. It was an empire built on corruption. And now, that empire was collapsing. The night the FBI came for him, it was raining. A storm rolled over the city, thunder rumbling low in the distance. Inside the Wolfe estate, a mansion so large it looked more like a kingdom, Ethan sat in his private study, a glass of whiskey in hand, eyes scanning the financial reports on his desk. He had heard the rumors, he knew they were closing in, but deep down he still believed he had time. He always had time. Until he didn't. A sudden crash shattered the silence. Then, footsteps, dozens of them, heavy, commanding, unstoppable. Before Ethan could react, his front doors burst open. FBI agents swarmed in, guns drawn, orders shouted. The glass in his hand slipped, crashed to the floor, flashing lights, the sounds of cameras clicking, the chaos of it all. And in the middle of it, Ethan Wolfe, standing frozen, trapped in a reality he never thought possible. They didn't give him a chance to protest, didn't give him a moment to call his lawyers. They forced him forward, past his security, his staff, his empire, now powerless to stop what was happening. Out the grand entrance, down the marble steps, and then handcuffs. The cold steel locked around his wrists, the moment the cameras had been waiting for. A billionaire. A king. A man who once ruled the financial world, dragged out of his own mansion like a common criminal. The flash of the press was blinding. Headlines were already being written. The fall of a titan. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Wolfe wasn't the one in control. The walls of the holding cell were cold, unremarkable, a stark contrast to the world Ethan Wolfe had built for himself. He sat on the metal bench, not in distress, not in fear, but in amusement. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to take him down. It wouldn't be the last. The press, the so-called justice system, the self-righteous government officials, they all thought they had him cornered. But Ethan knew better. He had escaped worse, controlled bigger, broken stronger. His eyes flicked to the thick folder now sitting on the metal table in front of him. His case file. His attorney, Jonathan Reeves, had placed it there moments ago, watching him with the same weary expression he always wore when Ethan refused to take things seriously. Ethan exhaled, bored, and finally flipped it open. And then, he saw the name. Naomi Carter. A silence stretched between them. Ethan's lips curled, the smallest twitch at first, then blooming into a slow, deliberate smirk. And then, he laughed. "You're joking." Reeves said nothing. Ethan shook his head, his fingers tapping against the edge of the file as if this were all some sort of elaborate prank. "A young, black woman is going to decide my fate?" His voice carried no anger, no panic, only disbelief. Because this was a joke. He leaned back against the cold wall, smirking to himself. They're really getting desperate. Reeves cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. He had been through this before. The arrogance, the bravado, the absolute refusal to believe that anyone ever could actually have power over Ethan Wolfe. "You should take her seriously," he said carefully. Ethan scoffed. "Why?" Reeves hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice lowering slightly. "Because she's not for sale, and she doesn't scare easy." For the first time, Ethan paused, not in worry, not in fear, just considering. Then he chuckled. They always say that. It was true. The bold ones, the righteous ones, the ones who claimed to be different, the ones who swore they couldn't be bought, couldn't be influenced, couldn't be shaken. They all cracked eventually. Sometimes it took money. Sometimes it took pressure. Sometimes all it took was reminding them who they were dealing with. Ethan picked up the folder again, flipping through the pages lazily, his smirk never faltering. Power is about leverage, Reeves, and a woman like her? He flicked the page, barely glancing at it. She has none. Reeves said nothing, because he knew Ethan believed it. And that was his first mistake. Power isn't just about money or influence, it's about controlling the narrative. Ethan Wolfe knew this better than anyone. For years he had shaped public perception like a sculptor working with clay, molding, twisting, erasing the inconvenient parts, and highlighting only what served him. And now, the man who once dictated the headlines was becoming one himself. That would not stand. The plan came together quickly, surgically, ruthlessly. Ethan's PR machine, one of the most powerful in the country, was activated overnight. Elite crisis managers, political spin doctors, former journalists who knew exactly how to plant a story without leaving fingerprints. Their objective? To dismantle Naomi Carter before she could dismantle him. Step 1. Plant the doubt. The first articles started subtly. Does Judge Naomi Carter have a conflict of interest? Who is the woman behind the robe? An unbiased judge or a woman with an agenda? The headlines weren't outright attacks. No, that would be too obvious. They were questions, just enough to make people wonder, to make the public hesitate, to make Naomi Carter go from a respected judge to a woman who maybe, just maybe, had something to hide. Step 2. The witness. 2 days later, a former defense attorney came forward, a man with just enough credibility to be dangerous. He claimed that years ago in an entirely different case, Naomi Carter had taken a bribe. No hard evidence. No real proof. But the accusation was loud enough to drown out the facts. And in the world of media, perception was reality. Step 3. Shift the public narrative. Within a week, the coverage had completely changed. Before, Ethan Wolfe was a billionaire on trial for financial crimes. Now, Naomi Carter was the one under scrutiny. Anchors on major networks didn't even need to say Ethan's name. They focused instead on whether the judge overseeing the trial was truly impartial. A panel of experts debated, should she recuse herself? Is this a political attack on a powerful businessman? Shouldn't we question a judge with such a questionable past? Ethan didn't need facts to win. He just needed doubt. And doubt, that was spreading like wildfire. Late one evening, Ethan sat in his private holding cell, the dim light of the mounted TV casting a soft glow over his face. He watched the news with a lazy smirk. A reporter read the latest poll numbers. Public trust in Judge Naomi Carter had dropped by 37%. Ethan leaned back, his smile widening. Checkmate. Or so he thought. The shift was subtle at first, a different tone in reporters' voices when they spoke her name. A few emails from colleagues left unanswered. A hesitation, a split second of delay before someone shook her hand. And then, just like that, the dam broke. The headlines had done their job. Public trust in Naomi Carter was unraveling faster than she could stop it. People who once stood by her, who championed her integrity, her fearlessness, were now backing away, afraid to be associated with her. The courthouse hallways, once filled with nods of respect, now carried only averted gazes and hushed whispers. The news anchors didn't even need to call her corrupt outright. They simply asked the questions. Should she step down? Can she truly be impartial? Is this about justice or something more personal? And just like that, the doubt became reality. Then came the letter. Official, federal, sealed, a summons to the chief judge's office. Naomi knew what it meant before she even opened it. She sat across from Chief Justice Hayes, a man she had worked under for years. A man who had once called her one of the brightest legal minds of her generation. Now, he looked at her like she was a problem that needed solving. Judge Carter, he began, his voice measured, diplomatic. The voice of a man who had already made up his mind. With everything happening in the media, the integrity of this case is being called into question. Naomi's jaw tightened. By who? Ethan Wolfe's people? He didn't answer. Didn't need to. Instead, he folded his hands neatly on the desk. For the sake of public confidence in the judiciary, we believe it would be best if you recused yourself from this case. There it was. Not a suggestion. Not a request. A command. The room felt smaller, colder. Naomi had spent her career fighting corruption, fighting men like Ethan Wolfe, and now, the very system she had dedicated her life to was turning its back on her. She wanted to fight, wanted to slam her hands on the desk, demand they stand by her. But as she sat there, alone in that office, something inside her whispered a question she had never dared ask before. Can I even win this? Not just the case, the war. Because that's what this was now. And Ethan Wolfe? He was winning. For the first time in her career, Naomi Carter felt truly alone. Her name, once synonymous with integrity, had become a question mark. The courthouse hallways that once held nods of respect and whispered admiration were now filled with doubt, hesitation, and cold glances. And Ethan Wolfe? He wasn't just watching it happen, he had orchestrated it. She could almost picture him now, leaning back in his cell, smirking at the headlines, knowing the world was turning against her. The system she had believed in? It was pushing her out. The whispers, the pressure, the official request for her to step down, it was all leading to one inevitable conclusion. She was losing. And for the first time, a thought crept into her mind. Maybe this is unwinnable. Maybe Ethan Wolfe was right. Maybe men like him never truly lose. She had spent years fighting corruption, exposing it, tearing it apart in court. But this wasn't just a legal battle. This was war. And war wasn't won by playing fair. The file sat on her desk, unopened. She had stared at it for hours, knowing what it contained, knowing what it could mean. A name she hadn't seen in a long time. Isaac Pierce, once one of Ethan Wolfe's top men, a trusted executive, a fixer, a man who had been inside Wolfe Global long enough to know where the bodies were buried. Until he disappeared. The official story, he retired, left the country. The truth, he had gone into hiding, not because he wanted to, because he had too much to say. And now, he was ready to talk. Late that night, Naomi walked into David Ramirez's office. The prosecutor was hunched over stacks of paperwork, exhaustion evident in his eyes. He didn't even look up. "If you're here to tell me you're stepping down, save it," he muttered. Naomi shut the door behind her. "I'm not stepping down." That got his attention. He studied her for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. "Then what do you want?" She slid the file across his desk. Isaac Pierce's name was printed at the top. Ramirez's brow furrowed as he flipped it open. His eyes scanned the pages. Wire transfers, confidential emails, internal memos, a direct trail linking Wolfe Global to financial crimes on a scale they had never been able to prove. Ramirez exhaled sharply. "Jesus Christ, where did you get this?" "It doesn't matter," Naomi replied. "What matters is that we use it." 2 days later, the first leak hit the media. A bank statement. A wire transfer. A direct financial connection between Ethan Wolfe and offshore accounts tied to bribery and fraud. And just like that, the headlines changed. Before, Naomi Carter was the corrupt judge. Now, Ethan Wolfe was the untouchable billionaire finally exposed. Within hours, news outlets picked up the story. Exclusive, hidden accounts linked to Wolfe Global exposed. Whistleblower breaks silence. The secrets of Ethan Wolfe's empire. Bribery, fraud, corruption, and the judge who refuses to back down. For days, Ethan had been controlling the narrative. Now, Naomi Carter had flipped the script. In his private holding cell, Ethan Wolfe watched the news unfold. His smirk, that ever-present, smug confidence, faltered. The screen flickered with his name, his crimes, his downfall. A moment ago, Naomi Carter was fighting to save herself. Now, the world was watching him crumble. His fingers curled into fists. This wasn't over. Not even close. The courtroom was silent. The kind of silence that weighs heavy, pressing against the walls, thick with tension. Every eye in the room was locked onto one man. Isaac Pierce, the witness. The man who once stood at Ethan Wolfe's side, who knew the secrets buried beneath the empire, and now, he was about to expose them. Naomi Carter sat at the bench, her face unreadable. But inside, she knew what was at stake. This testimony could be the final blow. The moment Wolfe's world crumbled. Pierce shifted in his seat. He cleared his throat, his hands gripping the wooden railing in front of him. Nervous, but resolute. Across the room, Ethan Wolfe sat motionless. He didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't even look angry, just watched. Like a man who already knew the ending of the story. Pierce took a breath. "I worked for Ethan Wolfe for over a decade." His voice was steady. "I saw everything. The offshore accounts, the money laundering, the bribery. Bang. A gunshot. The sound ripped through the courtroom like a lightning strike, shattering the tension in an instant. Screams erupted. Chairs scraped. Papers flew. Chaos. The security team sprang into action. "Get down!" Bailiffs rushed forward. Lawyers ducked beneath tables. Reporters scrambled for cover, their cameras still rolling. Naomi barely had time to react before armed officers surrounded her. Her ears were ringing, her heart hammering against her ribcage. Someone was shouting. Orders. Panic. A voice over the radio calling for backup. And then she saw him. Isaac Pierce, falling. His body slumped forward against the witness stand. Blood. A dark stain blooming across his chest. The man who held the key to Ethan Wolf's downfall, shot. Everything slowed. The echoes of the gunshot still lingered in the air, but Naomi's mind was racing. This wasn't a warning shot. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a message delivered with precision, with intent, a message that screamed power. She turned her head, her breath catching in her throat, and there, across the room, still seated, still calm, still watching, Ethan Wolf. His lips curled, just slightly. Not a full smirk, just a whisper of satisfaction. Like a man who had just reminded the world exactly who was in control. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your skin, heavy and unnatural. Naomi Carter pulled into her driveway, gripping the steering wheel tighter than she should. It had been a long day, a day of interrogations, lockdowns, and bloodstains on courtroom floors. Isaac Pierce was in surgery, barely hanging on, his testimony silenced before it could ever be heard. And Ethan Wolf? Untouched. Still sitting there, still watching. The thought made her stomach tighten. She took a slow breath, stepping out of her car, her heels clicking against the pavement. Then she saw it. A single white envelope, tucked neatly against her front door. No postage, no return address, just there, waiting. Her pulse quickened. Slowly she bent down, her fingers hesitating for half a second before picking it up. The envelope was smooth, unmarked, except for the writing across the front. Black ink, bold, precise, unmistakable. She unfolded the paper inside, her eyes scanning the words. Step down, or wait for the blood to spill. No name, no signature, just a threat, a promise. For a long moment, Naomi just stood there. The air felt thicker now, charged with something invisible yet suffocating. She had spent years fighting criminals, facing threats, dismantling corruption. But this was different. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was a war. And if she continued down this path, she wasn't sure she'd make it out alive. For the first time in his life, Ethan Wolf felt something foreign. Not anger. He had lived with that for years. Not fear. He didn't believe in it. It was something far worse, a feeling he never thought he'd experience. Defeat. And it all started with one man, Daniel Mercer. For over a decade, he had been Ethan's right hand, the fixer, the strategist, the man who knew where the money moved, who got paid, and who disappeared. Mercer had always been loyal, or at least that's what Ethan thought. But power blinds even the sharpest minds. And Mercer? He had been watching. Watching as Ethan built an empire on corruption and greed. Watching as he destroyed lives without a second thought. Watching as he treated loyalty like currency, to be spent, traded, or discarded. And when Mercer himself became expendable, he made a decision to burn it all down. It happened in the dead of night. A single encrypted drive. No press, no witnesses. Just a quiet meeting in a dimly lit parking garage. Naomi Carter stood across from Mercer, her hands tightening around the small device as she met his gaze. "This is everything?" she asked. Mercer nodded. No hesitation, no regret. Everything. The next morning, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Not just journalists, politicians, CEOs, business elites, people who had once toasted champagne with Ethan Wolf, who had benefited from his wealth and power. But today they came to witness the fall of a king. Naomi rose from her seat, steady, unshaken. She turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to submit new evidence into the record." A pause. Then, she reached into her briefcase, pulled out the drive, and placed it on the table. A single, deliberate motion. The room held its breath. Ethan's attorney shot up from his seat. "Objection. This is overruled." The judge's voice cut through the air. Firm, absolute. The files appeared on the courtroom screen, and within seconds, the truth was out. Emails, transactions, offshore accounts, the receipts of an empire built on deception, fraud, bribery, money laundering. The kind of evidence that no PR spin, no legal maneuver, no last-minute deal could erase. And Ethan Wolf? He sat in silence, his eyes scanning the files, his face unreadable. But Naomi saw it, that brief flicker of realization, the moment he understood. This wasn't a setback, this was the end. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the room. Phones buzzed. Journalists scrambled to update their headlines. The live broadcast exploded. And in that moment, Ethan Wolf wasn't a billionaire, wasn't a kingmaker, wasn't untouchable. He was just a man with nowhere left to run. He turned, scanning the room. Faces he recognized. Powerful men and women, former allies, business partners. People who once shook his hand, laughed at his jokes, defended his name. But now they looked at him with disgust, not fear, not admiration, just the cold, calculating detachment of people who had already moved on. Because in their world, a fallen king was just another liability. Naomi watched it happen, watched as the walls closed in, watched as the man who once controlled everything sat motionless, trapped in a reality he never saw coming. The bailiff stepped forward, the chains came out, and for the first time in his life, Ethan Wolf was well and truly alone. The verdict was read, guilty. The word hung heavy in the air, final and absolute. The courtroom, once a stage for Ethan Wolf's arrogance, was now a cage he couldn't escape. Naomi Carter watched as the bailiffs moved in, securing his wrists in cold steel. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the silent room. For the first time, Ethan Wolf was powerless. But he didn't fight, didn't shout, didn't lash out. Instead, he smiled. A slow, deliberate curl of his lips, as if the joke was on everyone else. As they led him toward the exit, he turned his head, just slightly, his sharp eyes locking onto Naomi. And then, he spoke. "You think you've won?" His voice was low, steady, too calm. "The game is just beginning." Naomi felt it then. A chill that crept down her spine, settling deep in her bones. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't a plea. It was a promise. The kind of promise that doesn't fade with prison walls. The kind that lingers, that waits, that never really ends. And as the doors slammed shut behind him, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling. This wasn't over. Not yet. The courtroom was empty now. The cameras had stopped rolling. The reporters had packed up their notebooks, their microphones, their urgency. The world was already moving on. But Naomi Carter? She was still there. Standing in the center of it all, staring at the spot where Ethan Wolf had been led away. His words still echoed in her mind. "The game is just beginning." A voice pulled her back. "Judge Carter." She turned. David Ramirez stood near the exit, his tie loosened, exhaustion lining his face. But in his eyes, something else. Not relief, not victory. Warning. "You won this battle," he said quietly. He held her gaze, his voice heavy, unshaken. "But the war isn't over." Naomi knew he was right. Ethan Wolf had fallen. But men like him, they never truly disappear. They wait, they rebuild, they find new shadows to hide in. And when the time is right, they strike again. Naomi let out a slow breath. She wasn't naive. She had seen how power works. But if Ethan Wolf thought she was afraid, he was wrong. She turned to Ramirez, her voice steady. "Then we keep fighting." And with that, she walked out of the courtroom, into a world that still wasn't finished with her. The end, or just the beginning. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps us out. Know someone who loves gripping stories about power, justice, and the fight for truth? Share this video with them and keep the conversation going. Bookmark back. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel so you never miss another powerful story. Your support fuels us to create more thought-provoking content, and we couldn't do it without you. Thank you for being part of this journey. Top of form, bottom of form.